Good afternoon to all our participants connected from China, and good morning to the participants connected from Europe and elsewhere. My name is Jacques Warichet. I work as a power system transformation analyst at the International Energy Agency, and I will be your host and moderator today. Thank you for joining this workshop, which is the third event of a series of webinars that the IEA is co-hosting with the Danish Embassy in Beijing, the DEA, the Danish Energy Agency, the German Agency for Cooperation, International Cooperation, GIZ, and our partners from China, EPPI, which is acting as a liaison office between the IEA and the Chinese administration. We also thank the French Development Agency, AFD, and the European Commission for their support for this webinar series. I will start with a few housekeeping rules for the event. For all the attendees and participants, the event is with simultaneous translation, so you can select the language you wish to listen to with the globe at the bottom of the Zoom window. Please select either Chinese or English if you wish to listen to one of these two languages exclusively, or leave the setup as a default if you wish to listen to the original language of the speakers. We will have also the opportunity for participants to ask questions to the speakers of sessions 1 and session 2. For that, we recommend using the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of the Zoom window. So we also recommend renaming yourself in the list of participants with your full name and your affiliation or name of organization. So without further ado, I will start this webinar by thanking again everyone. And we will have now the opening remarks. The first speaker today, thank you very much to the Danish Embassy for providing such a high-level speaker to us, is Thomas Ostrup Møller, the ambassador of Denmark to China. Over to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much, and also a very good afternoon to Division Director Xu and Vice President Zhang, to the distinguished speakers, moderators, participants, and of course, ladies and gentlemen, both online and offline. I'm indeed very grateful to give this opening remarks at the third webinar of the China Electric Power Sector Transformation Series. And I would like to, first of all, thank everyone who has been involved in organizing it. And I really deeply appreciate the mutual trust and cooperation with our Chinese partners, as well as the vast numbers of stakeholders who are heavily engaged in the collaboration between China and Denmark, not least the International Energy Agency and GIZ. Denmark has a strategic comprehensive partnership with China. And actually, presently, we are in the process of drafting a joint work program for the coming years. Together, we have also developed throughout times a very successful government-to-government cooperation on energy. And that is indeed something we are very proud of in Denmark. Today's webinar takes place on the backdrop of a global climate and energy crisis. The transition of power systems towards modern low-carbon pathways and technologies is imperative to meet climate goals, while also enabling other critical objectives such as sustainable economic development, energy security, energy access, and energy system resiliency. Today, the power and heating sectors are responsible for around 1/3, I repeat, 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. We need more power but it must be carbon neutral. And transitioning from black to green is the key to solving both the climate and the energy crisis. If we do not take this path, we risk locking ourselves into another high carbon decade and keeping the 1.5 degrees limit of the Paris Agreement out of reach. Power security, of course, is vital to all well-functioning modern societies and economies. But as countries across the globe transitioning to less carbon-intensive sources of electricity, system operators also face a number of ongoing challenges, as renewables generally require a higher degree of flexibility from the network and consumers to compensate for their intermittency. And this underlines the need for sharing knowledge and experience on this important topic. China is making quite a lot of progress in its own power sector transformation. And by 2025, China aims to have 33% of its electricity generated from renewable sources. This is against 28.8% in 2020, as formulated in the 5-year plan for the renewable sector. But China also faces challenges. Today, coal accounts for over 60% of electricity generation. And to meet its rising energy demand and ensure a stable and secure power supply, China continues to build new coal power plants domestically. This is, of course, a challenge to the overall decarbonization of China, as well as the transformation of the Chinese power sector. Many, including Danish companies, would like to invest in renewable energy in China, but find it difficult to find a site and making power purchasing agreements with the off-takers. The latter being, amongst others, manufacturing companies committed to shouldering their share of the green transition in China. Denmark has been one of the first movers in implementing a green transition and aims to become fully independent from fossil fuels by 2050. And the Danish power system has undergone a transformation, moving from a highly centralized to a more decentralized structure in electricity generation. There has been a significant increase, especially in wind power, but also in solar. Well-functioning power markets and broad-based political agreements on energy policy have provided security for investors, while enabling a smooth and continuous transition to a sustainable power sector. In fact, the liberalization of the Danish power sector is one of the steps that led Denmark to be at the forefront of renewable energy. So that was, in fact, a very substantial incentive to this transformation. Today, Denmark has become known around the world for its reliance on renewable energy, and wind and solar power together now account for more than a half of our electricity production. Offshore wind, in particular, is important due to its high rate of full load hours, and the planned energy island in the North Sea has the potential to generate 10 gigawatts, enough to cover the electricity consumption of 10 million households. By using advanced forecasting tools, creating a flexible generation system, and by maintaining strong transmission grids and interconnectors with neighboring countries, we are able to expand our reliance on renewable energy while maintaining a security of supply of 99.996% and a curtailment rate of only 2 to 3%. Not even fossil fuel systems are 100% secure. Power plants break down and imports are interrupted. But by creating a balanced systems, we are getting pretty close to full energy security based on renewable energy. And by planning our energy system for the long term, with clear policy signals, we give decision makers in both government and power companies the mandate and the confidence to invest in new technologies and processes. All of this is, of course, underpinned by a cross-border trading system where electricity is traded as a commodity, with competition keeping prices at right level for consumers and investors. Going forward, it is of vital importance that we bring the flexibility of consumption into play also here. Power markets and price signals are key. To give an example, the heat pump based on price signals and forecasting will optimize when heating and cooling should be delivered with the lowest cost for the consumer and the best support to the system. So, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, I would like to end my opening statement by wishing everyone a great webinar and extend my warm thanks to all stakeholders who have contributed. Thank you so much. 谢谢.
The next speaker is Mr. Jiang Shihong. He is the Vice President at the China's Electric Power Planning and Energy Institute, EPPI, or Liaison Office for the IEA and China's administration. Over to you, my colleagues from EPPI. Thank you very much for your opening remarks.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Müller, Director Xu, ladies and gentlemen, friends, greetings to everyone. I'm pleased to attend the third webinar remotely. I would like to, on behalf of EPPI, congratulate you on the successful opening of this meeting. Thank you to the leaders and the guests who attended this meeting. Energy and power are important material basis and the power source for economic and social development, the main battlefield for promoting carbon neutrality. Accelerating the pace of the power transformation, promoting low carbon green development, and actively addressing climate change have become an irreversible trend of the times. 2022 is the key year of the 14th five-year plan. It is important to plan the route of energy transition in China, especially the transformation of the power industry. At the 75th ENG, Chinese President Xi Jinping put forward China's dual carbon goals, demonstrating China's ambition and determination to follow the path of a high-quality energy development, demonstrating China's initiative to fulfill its international responsibilities, and injecting new powerful momentum into the world's energy transformation. China's power transformation has achieved development by leaps and bounds. First, China's power production capacity has been steadily improved. In 2021, China's installed power capacity reached 2.38 terawatts, with a year-on-year growth of 9.5. Secondly, the green low-carbon transformation of the power sector is accelerating. In 2021, non-fossil energy installed capacity increased to 47%, exceeding coal power installed capacity for the first time. By the end of June 2022, the installed capacity of renewable energy generation in China reached 1.118 terawatts, accounting for 1/3 of the installed capacity of renewable energy in the world. Thirdly, China's power system flexibility has been effectively enhanced. In 2021, China's coal power flexibility transformation exceeded 80 million kilowatts, and the utilization rate of wind power, photovoltaic, and hydro reached 96.6%, 98%, and 97.9% respectively. Fourthly, the power market reform continued to advance. The National Unified Power Market System started construction. The medium to long-term trading mechanism was fully established, and the auxiliary service market steadily advanced. The market traded power in 2021 reached 370 GWh, accounting for 44.6% of the total power consumption. The national electricity market has about 300 GWh of electricity directly traded in the medium and long term, an increase of 22.8% year-on-year. At present, the world energy landscape is undergoing profound changes. We are expecting the IEA to continue to play a leading role in global energy governance. One is to promote communication exchange amongst countries on power transformation paths, focus on the issues of international concerns, such as high proportion of new energy consumption and reliable alternatives. IEA is expected to carry out joint research, technological exchange, and capacity building, promoting large-scale, high-proportion deployment of renewables. The second is to deepen the cooperation on innovation of advanced technologies of power systems in various countries, and to carry out joint research and development in the fields of power system flexibility improvement. The third is to strengthen the sharing experience of power market reform and to share the best practices from various countries in view of the key elements, such as spot market, medium and long-term power trading, price mechanism, so that we could all contribute to the sustainable development of energy. The transformation of the power sector is essential to synergize global green and low carbon development of energy. We hope that during this session, experts will focus on the hotspots, difficulties, and pain points of China's electricity power sector. Last but not least, I wish you every success of this meeting. I'm looking forward to meet all the delegates in person. Thank you all.
Thank you very much to all three speakers for these excellent opening remarks. This takes us to the first session, which will be moderated by my colleague Sune Kari Sørensen, climate and energy attaché at the Danish embassy in Beijing. He will moderate this session and invite the speakers one by one. Sune, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacques. I've been working with the Danish Energy Partnership with China for a number of years, and as such, I've had the pleasure of participating in the first two webinars on China's electric power sector transformation. Honestly, I believe that for today's third webinar, we have an exceptionally strong lineup. We also have a very tight schedule, so I would like to remind all four speakers of this session to limit their presentations to a maximum of 15 minutes. Otherwise, I will have to intervene. The good news is that so far we are on time. Now, the first presenter of the day is Mr. Fang Xiaoshong. He is a distinguished expert in his field and currently serves as the director of the International Department in the China Electric Power Planning and Engineering Institute. He will take stock of the latest policy developments in China's power sector. Please, Mr. Fang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Hello, everyone. I'm grateful to share our points of China's power system vision. Now, for the last decade, China has been one of the fastest growing energy and power industry in the world, and the going on transition of energy and power system is also very impressive. I would like to highlight three aspects with some facts and figures. Now, the first aspect is about the energy sector transition. Firstly, China's energy production capacity has been steadily improved. The growth rate of primary energy production hit a 10-year high in 2021. The rapid development of the economy is guaranteed by relatively lower energy consumption growth, which means the intensity of energy consumption has been reduced. And secondly, China's transition towards greener energy has been accelerated. In 2021, the proportion of non-fossil energy production and consumption reached 20% and 16% respectively. Energy intensity dropped by 2.7 percentage points, and the carbon emissions intensity decreased by 3.8 percentage points. The second aspect is about the power sector transition. We got more details here. Firstly, on the power supply side, China's power supply capacity has been gradually strengthened. In 2021, China's installed power capacity reached 2.4 terawatt, with a year-on-year growth of 9.5%, and electricity per capita of China reaches 6,000 kilowatt hours. And the proportion of renewable power supply has significantly increased in China. In 2021, China's installed renewable power capacity exceeded 1.1 terawatt, with wind and solar power ranking the first in the world. Secondly, on the power grid side, China's power grid scale has been steadily expanded. By the end of 2021, the length of China's transmission lines reaches 843,000 kilometers. The length of high voltage distribution lines above 1 million kilometers. As you may know, China's green energy resources and big load centers is geographically unmatched. To mitigate the gap and to realize the optimization of green energy nationwide, China has built the world's largest power system, transforming about 300 terawatt hours of green power yearly from the West region to the East region. Thirdly, on the power consumption sustains a rapid growth rate, and the structure of power consumption is shifting from the secondary to the tertiary and the residential sector. China has also initiatives for high energy consumption industry deploying via the regions with rich renewable energy resources. And China encourages green power substitution in the key areas such as electric vehicles, electric heating, industrial electric boilers, and other areas. Fourthly, on the flexibility of power system. For high renewable power system, the flexibility is a big issue. China's power system flexibility has been effectively enhanced by coal power flexibility retrofit, expansion of pumped storage, electrochemical energy storage, and the improvement of demand-side management and response capabilities. The last aspect I'd like to mention is about power market reform. I will give a concise summary. Firstly, China's electric spot market has been built orderly, and the construction of a unified electricity market has been accelerated. The market traded power in 2021 reached 370 gigawatt hour, accounting for 44% of total power consumption with a 40% average growth rate. The medium and long-term trading mechanisms have been fully established. The spot market pilot keeps running, and the auxiliary service market is running steadily. Secondly, the electricity price reform has been continuously optimized, and the system and the mechanism have been further improved in transmission and distribution pricing system, market reform on feed-in tariff, time of use tariff, and tiered pricing mechanism. Thirdly, the reform of incremental distribution business is steadily promoted, and the management of power sales companies is more refined. By the end of 2021, power sales companies established about 400 pilot projects. Around 5,000 power sales companies have registered to provide services in power purchase and sales business, contract energy management, and comprehensive energy conservation. That's all for my sharing about China's power system transition. By the end of my presentation, I would like to emphasize that EPPI will do our best in the transition of China's power and energy for a green future. This year is the 70th anniversary of EPPI. Thanks for the valuable support from our partners, both domestic and overseas. It's an honor for us to share the knowledge, wisdom, and practice with all of you. Hope to have more fruitful cooperation and exchange later on. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Good day to all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Fang, for giving us a short, concise, and very interesting overview of the significant policy updates that has taken place and been announced in terms of relating to the Chinese power sector landscape. It's difficult not to be humbled by the numbers you mentioned. I would encourage all viewers to articulate questions in the Q&A to Mr. Fang, which we hopefully will have time to get back to by the end of this session. Now, for the second presentation, we are joined by Mr. Anders Hove, who is the project director for the Energy Transition Project at GIZ, our co-hosts today. Mr. Hove also serves as a non-resident fellow at Columbia University on global energy policy and as a fellow at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. He has worked in Beijing since 2010 and has more than 20 years of public and private sector experience related to energy policy and markets, including roughly a decade on Wall Street and over a decade in China. Today, Mr. Hove will elaborate on how electric power markets can work to ensure energy security for China based on German experiences. Now, please, Anders, the floor is yours.
So no, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. And I'd like to also thank the IEA and the National Energy Administration, as well as the Danish Ambassador and the Danish Energy Agency, as well as especially I'd like to thank our Chinese partners, EPPI, as well as China Southern Grid Energy Development Research Institute. As mentioned, I'll be talking today about the trends in capacity adequacy and flexibility in Germany, Europe, and also relating those lessons to China, where possible, I will be drawing comparisons and contrasts. So I'd like to talk about why we need to discuss flexibility and capacity adequacy together, how Germany has achieved flexibility so far, and how that compares with China. As well, I'd like to talk about future flexibility measures and whether Germany's capacity is adequate to meet its needs in an increasing renewable world. Here, I'm also going to mention the present energy crisis and measures that Germany and Europe are taking. And then I will compare to some recent research on China, as well as measures taken by China in 2021 and 2022 to respond to power outages in those years. Now, I'm going to emphasize first that Germany has already achieved a fairly high penetration of renewable energy, with the 2021 renewable share already reaching over 45% and the wind and solar share over 33%. Renewables likely crossed 50% this year so far, and each unit of renewable energy has clearly contributed to the country's energy security by substituting for expensive gas imports and preserving that gas for use in more important sectors, such as residential heating. That larger variable renewable energy share means a much higher need for flexibility, which of course I'll come back to. First, I just want to briefly touch on the China share is currently 12% wind and solar combined. Now that's not a criticism because China has meanwhile scaled up wind and solar to reach well over 300 gigawatts each at the end of 2021. And I expect that by the end of this year, China will have a combined over 700 gigawatts of wind and solar by the end of the year. That's more than 6 times the installed wind and solar capacity of Germany. Now, one thing that is different between China and Germany is the far higher percentage of centralized wind and solar in China. You can see, you can see on the bar chart of solar that China has only recently started to scale up distributed solar. Now, in my view, distributed solar is easier to integrate into the grid because of its location near to urban loads. And that's particularly beneficial during the summer months in regions that need air conditioning. Moving to the topic of flexibility, how does Germany integrate that 33% of variable renewable energy it has right now? The most important factor in my view is the flexibility of the thermal power plants in Germany, including coal, which still accounts for a larger share than gas. You can see that in the course of a few hours of a typical week in Germany, coal plants are able to substantially ramp up when wind and power and load are falling. You can also find a more dramatic case of this ramping, but this is more of a typical week. And sometimes in China, we do get asked about which coal plants are targeted for flexibility upgrades. I would say, generally speaking, that all of the coal plants in Germany now are highly flexible and are able to ramp up and down depending on the economics of doing so. And as we'll see later, this is primarily driven by the market. Now, I just want to contrast the graphs that I just showed with a different vision for how to operate a power system with a high proportion of renewables. This is not an actual situation. This is a 2030 view of what China could look like with about the same percentage of wind and solar as what I portrayed in Germany so far. And here the system is operated not with flexible thermal fleet, but instead with energy storage taking up all the need for flexibility. So in this scenario, basically energy storage has to have at least as much capacity as all of the solar on the grid so that the thermal plants can operate very in a sort of a base load or flat operation mode. And I think that this is basically a very expensive way of doing flexibility because it requires substantially more advanced investment cost. And it also basically does not enable renewables to maximally reduce the carbon emissions of the coal fleet by basically ramping down coal when renewables are available. Now, I want to mention as well that Germany's ramping situation is actually the highest ramping demand of any price zone in Europe. That's partly because, of course, Germany is this one huge price zone covering the whole country. But the ramping need of Germany, just to give you an idea of the scale, it's about 12 gigawatts at the maximum. And that would be the maximum that it would ever encounter in a typical year, but more typically 10 gigawatts ramping capability. I want in this slide to briefly mention that we published in 2019, together with NDRC ERI, a quantitative comparison of the Jingjiangji region around Beijing with the country of Germany, and in particular looking at the flexibility of the coal power fleet. And essentially what we showed is that the coal power fleet in Germany is substantially more flexible. And this is what enables basically the German power system to be more reliable and at lower loss hours than the case of Jingjiangji. This is a look at basically the power market in Germany. And it's already mentioned that China is going for power market reforms since 2015. And one of the aspects of those power market reforms is the spot power market. This graph shows that essentially about 25 terawatt hours of annual demand in the German power market is traded on the spot power market. And most of that is in the actually intraday market, with the day ahead market also playing a major role. So that's about 2/3 of the volume of Germany's power purchases are being traded in the spot power market. already mentioned that China is going for a unified national power market by 2030. Currently, there are pilot projects of spot markets in various provinces, but I would like to note that the volume that I mentioned about Germany is substantially larger in proportion. Of course, that reflects the fact that these are largely pilot markets, but I believe that the percentage that you saw on screen earlier of the national trading last year was around 6 to 7% of total power market volumes were being traded in the spot power market. I looked at Guangdong province, and basically the percentage from Guangdong province, which is one of the earlier pilots and more advanced pilots, is a similar percentage of total power being traded on the spot power markets. And in general, that low volume means that the spot power markets are not really able to incentivize most power plants to operate with the maximum flexibility, and as well, essentially, that the participating plants have caps and floors on prices that they're facing, so that also decreases the incentive for flexibility. So to sum up, Germany has relied on spot power markets to drive flexibility in the marketplace and encourage power plant owners to invest in upgrades necessary for flexible operations. I would also mention interconnectors. These account for about 10% of Germany's daily load, sometimes exporting, sometimes importing. Having bidirectional power flows is critical to handling those daily load ramps that I mentioned. Energy storage, so far, is a minor factor. Now, to reach 80% renewables or 100% zero carbon electricity by 2035, Germany will clearly need more flexibility, and I believe that that will be achieved through customer-sided batteries, demand response, aggregation service providers, including energy communities, smart charging of electric vehicles, as well as vehicle-to-grid technology. Currently, Germany has a small market for aggregating loads and demand response, and most of those are night heaters. So this market is, I would say, still fairly small, but it's likely to grow very quickly. And I think that one of the reasons why storage in this pie chart has not been a factor so far is that storage is right now managed only for self-consumption. Until now, there was a surcharge on any electricity that was sent into the grid from storage, which seriously disincentivized using batteries for grid services. Now, in this graph, you can see that we are seeing exponential growth in battery capacity in Germany. We have now reached 2 gigawatts of battery capacity connected to the grid for residential consumers, and anticipate that this will reach 5 gigawatts this year. So 2 gigawatts is already 1/5 or 1/6 of the maximum ramping that Germany needs. So this battery storage could be a very important flexibility resource, could be. If Germany continues on this growth path, home storage could provide 1/4 of the country's ramping needs, and storage could help meet evening peak loads in regions where there is strong PV output, since most storage is paired together with solar PV. Large-scale systems exist as well, but they are 1/3 the size of the cumulative residential storage capacity. I don't have a graph of how that storage is currently being dispatched, but this just shows how quickly the output of storage facilities can change on a year-to-year basis, looking at the California case. Here is looking at the comparison with China. Basically, almost all of the storage that is located in China is on the generation side and a substantial part on the grid side. Very little storage on the load side, and most of that would, of course, be on, I would say, industrial or large commercial users. Most provinces of China have adopted mandates that new renewable energy should only be connected with storage also located at or near those large-scale renewable sites. This is just a list of priorities, I think, for the future system, what types of flexibility resources we will need to ensure that the demand side, both those batteries, smart EV charging, as well as demand response, aggregation, what sort of signals will the demand side need? I would particularly highlight the need to incentivize flexibility through energy market price signals. Now, all of this flexibility that Germany has brought on board today and will bring on board in future years has enabled a very reliable power system. It's hard to read these graphs, I know. On the left, you can see that Germany basically is the lowest purple line on the bottom, the lowest number of operating hours lost of most countries in Europe. And on the right-hand graph, you can see the proportion of renewable energy matched together with the number of outage hours. Germany is roughly in the middle in terms of the proportion of renewable energy, but the operating hours lost, the outage hours are very small. Up until last year, the forecast for 2030 of ENSO-E in Europe were that essentially most countries of Europe would remain reliable despite the massive scaling up of renewables. Blue on the map essentially indicates very low acceptable outage hours, and that was the forecast last year. Now, this year, of course, we are in the middle of a major energy crisis, so our ministry, BMWK, asked the TSOs to perform a stress test, and those stress tests showed that there is unlikely to be a physical shortage of electricity this year. Basically, the crisis situations are very unlikely this winter, despite the gas supply problem, but they cannot be entirely excluded. So Germany is activating its coal reserve, that's already been done, as well as establishing a new deployment reserve of 2 nuclear plants that will be non-operational next year. So Germany, basically up until now, has used power markets to promote renewable and renewable integration, as well as flexibility. Germany is making progress with new technologies, both storage and demand response. Now, Europe, on the other hand, is experiencing a crisis in energy costs. The main causes are the sudden need to preserve gas, as well as the outages at the French nuclear fleet. In my opinion, electrification, renewables, storage, demand response, these are the main long-term measures to solve these problems. And the energy reserve system has been shown to be more necessary. And just a brief look at a couple of researches that we have been involved with in the past few years, as well as part of this series, the 2019 China Power System Transformation Report of the IEA showed that a flexible use of interconnectors as well as spot power market integration across Chinese provinces were the lowest cost solution for providing flexibility and integrating large proportion of renewables. As well, there's a really excellent publication recently from scholars at Berkeley and other institutions showing that essentially flexible use of the transmission system, including just the existing transmission system, could be the lowest cost measure to improve flexibility in China. And as well, we are closely watching the developments in Sichuan and Chongqing in the wake of the drought and heat-related power outages in the last few months. Basically, we saw incredibly high spikes in air conditioning load, and we also saw the result of drought conditions reducing hydropower output at a time when the power system was not sufficiently flexible to carry power between regions to meet up those deficits that Sichuan was experiencing. So I think that this power crisis does highlight the need for additional flexibility in the transmission system and additional flexibility in the trading of power between provinces of China. So just to sum up a few conclusions, in my opinion, the high volume day ahead and intraday spot markets in Germany, as well as the flexible and bidirectional operation of interconnections, have been the key characteristics that enabled flexibility in Germany so far. To answer a question that I know that many people have posed, essentially the coal plant reserve that Germany established was established as an emergency measure, and that has now been activated. However, the experts that we have talked to so far in Germany do not perceive a widespread need for a capacity market, but this is currently under debate. In China, of course, there is already underway a spot power market, but the rapid scale up of this power market would certainly help incentivize flexibility as well as flexible operation of the transmission system. So I hope I didn't go over too far, but I want to thank IEA again, as well as our host, Suna, for having me, and I'd look forward to any discussion.
Thank you, Anders. That was exactly 14 minutes and 59 seconds. So you were on point, both in terms of time and your presentation. Thank you so much. Now, for the third presenter, I will introduce Ms. Kia Maria Jerichau, who serves as Director of Ancillary Services at Energinet. Energinet is an independent public enterprise owned partly by the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. And Energinet owns, operates and develops the transmission systems for electricity and gas in Denmark. Now, in her daily work, Ms. Jerichau is is looking for the way to balance 100% green energy system with flexibility, digitization, and market-based approaches to system services. Today, she will enlighten us on this, specifically flexibility through the clean energy transitions, by giving an overview of how flexibility is provided today and tomorrow in systems with high shares of variable renewable energy to ensure electricity security. Now, Ms. Jakob, please, the floor is yours.
So here we go. And thank you for the presentation. I hope you still bear the presentation in mind. I'm going to give you an introduction to flexibility through the clean energy transitions, and perhaps give you a more hands-on view on how we use flexibility in balancing our system. First of all, perhaps just a comment on different types of flexibility. When we talk about flexibility, I normally divide it in two groups: implicit flexibility and explicit flexibility. So implicit flexibility is when you have a demand response to the electricity price, whereas explicit flexibility is when you have a market for flexibility and you are able to also have profits when you put your flexibility into the system. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, and the different ancillary services that we use in Energinet for balancing the service, balancing the grid, and how we are moving towards having many more renewable energy as part of these ancillary services markets. Just a little bit about Denmark and the Danish TSO Energinet. What's important to know about Denmark is that we are a quite small country, as you know, but we are very well connected when it comes to electricity. So we have a lot of interconnectors and we have a lot of transmission across borders. We also have very high shares of wind and solar and yeah, a very high exchange capacity. We are aiming towards having a 100% green electricity system in 2030, which means that when we reach 2030 in 8 years, we will only have renewable energy sources also for our balancing of the grid. This creates quite a lot of challenges in this 100% renewable energy-based electricity system. And when it comes to balancing the system, the challenges are that we, as for now, we see a quite inflexible of classical consumption. We also see an increased demand and cost for our ancillary services, and we see increasing internal bottlenecks in the grid. We have a lot of rise in production, a lot of rise in consumption, but unfortunately, it's not in the same places geographically. So we have increased bottlenecks. And we have reduced thermal power capacity, which makes it increasingly difficult to balance the system, because fluctuating energy creates more imbalances, and we don't have the same capacity for countering these imbalances. So we need to come up with some new solutions. Just a short introduction to the Danish energy and reserve markets. We buy our reserve capacities before our day-ahead market, and then we have our market for energy in the day-ahead market, which sets the electricity price. We have the intraday market, where the different balancing actors can buy energy to make sure they are as close to balancing the system as they can be. And then we have, in the end, the balancing market, where we buy energy for balancing the system close to the operational hour. In Denmark, we use proactive balancing, which means that we try to create prognoses that tells us how much balancing energy we need in the coming 15 minutes or an hour. This sets a very high standard for our prognoses, and of course, this also becomes increasingly difficult when you have more fluctuating energy like solar and wind. So what's important for our market actors and for everyone entering the energy markets right now is that because we've created markets for flexibility, there are quite a lot of business opportunities for different market actors in releasing their flexibility potential. And normally we tell them that what they need to think about is what is their response time, what's the time period where they will be able to regulate their unit, and how much energy are they able to regulate within the given time period. And all of this creates different types of business opportunities for our market actors. Normally, I say that if you have an energy consumption or you have energy production, you are eligible for putting your flexibility into the markets and earning some cash. So just a little bit about our different technologies for ancillary services. I'm not going to go through all of these. The things you can see on the sides is the different types of ancillary services, but what's important to notice here is what are the technologies that we are expecting to help us with balancing our system in the future. And as you can see, we are reducing our thermal power capacity, and we are using a lot of other technologies for balancing the system, such as wind, solar, consumption, batteries, and also electrolysis. So I'm going to go a bit further into how we use wind, solar, and hydrogen production for our ancillary services. First, a little bit about the problems that all this wind and solar creates in our system. What you can see here is the red line is our consumption in Denmark, and you can then see the wind and solar in the bottom, and how it fluctuates, and also how it's increasingly fluctuating when we move beyond 2030. So we need to figure out what to do about the dips, and we also need to figure out what to do with the extra energy production that will be in our system in the coming 10 years. This is just a little bit about the balance between our renewables and our consumption. As you can see on the top graph, this is an overview of our solar production. Of course, we have a lot of production during the summer, and we have a lot of production during the daylight hours. So that makes sense. The next one is the wind, where you can see that there's mostly wind during the winter months and a little bit less during the summer months. So luckily the solar and the wind actually average each other out a bit. Then we have the consumption, where you can also see that we have a higher consumption during the winter months. That's because, of course, of heating in Denmark. And if you then look at the bottom one, you see the residual between our consumption and our wind and solar production. So we have some peak dispatchable capacity and some peak consumption where the numbers don't really add up. And we believe that hydrogen production will be one of the solutions in bridging these two. A little bit more about the challenges that renewable energy creates for balancing the system. What you see here on the top graph is the wind share of production in Denmark, and then you see our system imbalances. So what you can see is that the higher the share of wind production, the higher our system imbalances are. That's what you see on the two red lines that sort of shows you how the trend is in this. So we are expecting, as we move towards 100% green electricity system, we will also see many more imbalances that we need to counter with flexibility products. So one of the solutions is to allow for solar and wind to participate in our markets for flexibility and ancillary services. So as of this year, we have allowed solar and wind and other renewables, that could also be consumption, to participate in our reserve markets. Normally, you wouldn't, I think most countries are a little bit wary of allowing solar and wind to act as an reserve for upwards regulation, but we've allowed it based on forecasting precision. So what we do is we ask, for example, a wind turbine portfolio to create a forecast for their wind, and then they are allowed to participate in our markets with the 10% quantile of that probabilistic forecast. And so far, it has given us really great results. And I think this is one of the important points for looking at flexibility in a renewable system, that all this new renewable energy has to be part of the solutions for the energy system and not just something that creates more problems for us. And I think this is a good example of that. The next thing is that in Denmark, we see a lot of power to X projects, a lot of electrolyte, and we see increasing consumption patterns for hydrogen production. So of course, also this is one of the places where we need hydrogen production to become part of the solution, and not just this big consumption that we have to handle in our balancing of the system. So we've created some calculations where we actually show the hydrogen developers that it would be a good business case for them to think about flexibility in their projects from the beginning. Because if they start looking at reserves and the income from reserves and flexibility markets, then we believe that they would actually be able to have a better business case. But they need to do it in the beginning, because there's a very big link between their storage and their dimensioning of the plants. And I think this is, again, another example of how all these new green technologies don't just create problems for the system, but can also be part of the solution. Yes, that was it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jerikau, for a very comprehensive and on-point presentation that was also within the time limits. So moving on to the fourth speaker, I hope, Mr. Fischer, that you are present in the International Energy Agency. Mr. David Fischer is a project coordinator and climate policy analyst at the International Energy Agency, where he leads and provides expertise to different climate policy projects, in particular the IEA's longstanding China ETS advisory project. Today, Mr. Fischer will tell us how an enhanced ETS for the power sector can promote efficiency and resiliency of the power system, while also accelerating the clean energy transition. Now, Mr. Fischer, I hope you're there. So without further ado, I would give the floor to you.
Thank you, Sune. It's my pleasure today to present to you on the emissions trading system and power markets reform And thank you also to all the organizers and for the great opening remarks that we heard earlier as well. My presentation, as Sune just mentioned, will focus on the interaction between ETS, the Chinese national ETS, and the power markets reform, and draw especially on key findings from our most recent report that we produced together with 3E Institute at Tsinghua University, entitled Enhancing China's ETS for Carbon Neutrality, with a focus on the power sector. Now, as already mentioned earlier, in September 2020, President Xi Jinping announced that China will peak CO2 emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. The national ETS in China is a key instrument, of course, to achieve those decarbonization or dual carbon goals. Its ETS came into operation, and by that I mean it started trading in July 2021 and finished its first compliance period with a compliance rate of 99.5%. It currently covers only the power sector, which however emits around 4.5 gigatons CO2 annually, which roughly represents 40% of China's energy sector CO2 emissions. The allowance price at the moment fluctuates around 60 Chinese yuan per ton of CO2, which is around $8. Now, crucially, the China ETS, in contrast to a lot of other emission trading systems across the world, is an output and intensity-based allowance system, meaning that allowances are allocated against a power producer's electricity production and with predetermined emission intensity benchmarks. And there's 4 different benchmarks covering coal and gas-fired units, and there's no predetermined emissions cap, as for example there is in the EU ETS. Allowances are also allocated for free, but of course there is a possibility that in the future auctions will be introduced, which would mean that power producers would have to purchase from the regulator in auctions the allowances that they require to meet their compliance requirements. Now, what we see here on this chart, and I'll walk you through because it's a bit more complicated, is on the left side and on both sides a merit order curve, as you would expect in a liberalized power market system under economic dispatch. On the left, you see a merit order curve without carbon pricing, on the right one with carbon pricing. And normally in an economic dispatch and a liberalized power market, you would expect under normal market circumstances, so not the circumstances that Anders already mentioned earlier, that we currently have in Europe, you would expect that a gas-fired power plant is the price setter, meaning it delivers the last megawatt hour of demand or power generation, which is demanded from the market at a given price, and that price then sets the power price in the wholesale market. Now, if we introduce a carbon price into that system, we have a few different effects. On the one side, the price normally would be slightly higher, which would also lead, however, to a certain reduction of consumption or an incentive to reduce consumption. But also, and crucially, under normal market circumstances, we would have a fuel switching from coal to gas, as coal, of course, is more emissions intensive and gas is less emission intensive. So therefore, a carbon price can strengthen the cost and competitiveness of lower carbon technologies and drive that fuel switching. And just here also summarized, the first point I already just mentioned, a carbon price leads to a prioritization of lower carbon generation sources in dispatch decisions. And it also incentivizes investment through that in low carbon technologies and assets, especially vis-a-vis carbon intensive assets. And thirdly, it can also encourage efficiency in end use and demand reduction, as I mentioned previously as well. Now, if however an ETS meets a regulated power market, we see a few challenges. If a power market uses, as mostly in China, an administratively determined dispatch, such a carbon price might not be fully or not at all integrated into dispatch decisions. And that can then, of course, also lead to muting or limiting the effectiveness of a carbon price in making low carbon alternatives in that power market more profitable and respectively also more attractive for investors. Now, regulated pricing also, of course, can limit the ability to pass through a carbon price signal, and therefore then also lead to a demand reduction. But also connected to that limited ability to pass through carbon costs in a regulated power market, is that it can lead to financial difficulty for fossil generation assets, as they will have to carry then that carbon cost. Now, in order to see how different ETS designs perform in a liberalized power market, we designed together with Tsinghua University 5 different scenarios and modeled them and produced results around decarbonization, generation mix, and also costs. Now, the first scenario that we used was a counterfactual. We call it RPS, where we now have no emissions trading system and just renewable energy targets. The second one is the current policy scenario, so a intensity-based ETS with free allocation is currently implemented in China, and we call this an RPS ETS scenario. And then we have 3 enhanced ETS scenarios. One is the ETS benchmark system, or BM, which is an intensity-based ETS with a stronger tightening of the coal benchmarks that are used for allocation of allowances. So those are the emission intensity benchmarks that I mentioned earlier. Then we would have an ETS auction scenario where we have an intensity-based ETS with the introduction of partial auctioning. And then the last but not least enhanced ETS scenario is the ETS cap scenario, where we would see a cap and trade ETS with free allocation. So to a certain extent, similar to the EU ETS. Now, all of these scenarios assume in our modeling economic dispatch from 2025, and also include, crucially, the ability for interprovincial trade, and also, of course, assumptions there on growth going forward for interprovincial trade and transmission lines. And all of these scenarios share the same non-hydro renewables share targets. Now, what we can see in those scenarios is that even under the current policy scenario, the ETS is able, within a liberalized power market, to reduce CO2 emissions from electricity generation by 2035 by 20%. This is further increased, or rather doubled, compared to the current policy scenario, so the RPS ETS in the enhanced ETS scenarios, down to 62% of 2020 emission levels. Now, the synergy between the ETS and the power market reform we can see especially in this graph, which I'll show you in a second, where we can identify that through there being in the scenario a liberalized power market from 2025 and economic dispatch, the ETS had the ability to then drive efficiency improvements and also fuel switching, as well as you will see later, a diversification of the generation mix. So even in the current policy scenario, so where we do not enhance ETS much, we see that especially by 2025 already, we would find coal fleet efficiency improvements, which mean especially that running hours of ultra supercritical plants would increase, whereas of less efficient coal-fired power plants such as subcriticals would decrease. And then we also see the build out of coal with CCUS, or switch from unabated to coal with CCS, which is mainly driven through the benchmarks that I mentioned earlier, which is a particular element of the Chinese ETS. Now, in the BM, or enhanced ETS benchmark scenario, we would see an amplification of especially the switch from unabated coal to coal with CCUS. Whereas in auctioning and a cap, we would see especially increases or a switch from fossil to non-fossil or renewable technologies, because the carbon cost for all fossil generation technologies is higher, given because of the design of the ETS in those two scenarios, and therefore then leads to a switch to renewables. Now, in the ETS cap, we also have some technical fleet efficiency improvements or coal power efficiency improvements. However, the overall operational efficiency of the fleet decreases as the running hours for all coal-fired power plants in that scenario decrease across the different coal-fire technologies. Now, in terms of how it can change the generation mix as well, we see across all scenarios that there's a phase down of unabated coal driven through the introduction of an ETS, and especially so by 2035 in the enhanced ETS scenarios. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, we have different levels of CCUS being deployed, while, however, the ETS in a liberalized power market system is especially able in the enhanced ETS scenarios to reach the RPS or the renewable portfolio share targets for non-hydro by 2035, and especially in the auction and the cap scenario even overachieve them, as it's able to deliver the financial incentives for further deployment of renewables in those scenarios. Now, these different design or ETS design opportunities come also at different costs. Overall, roughly, the current policy scenario would land in 2035 at a total system cost of around 4 trillion Chinese yuan, whereas in the ETS cap, interestingly, we could achieve an additional 800 million tons CO2 emission reductions, but at no additional cost, as it incentivizes especially fuel switching to cheaper renewable technologies. The BM scenario, so where we very much have the current policy scenario, but with more stringent benchmarks, leads to 5% higher costs, whereas the ETS auction scenario leads to slightly higher costs than the current policy. Now, in conclusion, what we can see from that is that we can identify a strong synergy between the national ETS and the power markets reform. And I would even say the power markets reform and economic dispatch is very much a condition for the national ETS to really be able to drive the changes that I just presented, and to promote efficient generation sources, and also provide or incentivize a more diversified generation mix. Now, timely power markets reform on dispatch and pricing mechanisms is therefore then also important for the effectiveness of the national ETS, if it is to drive decarbonization towards the dual carbon goals. And an enhanced ETS in such a market environment can then accelerate the electricity sector alignment with the carbon neutrality trajectory. And as already shown also, the ETS can then drive, depending on its design, different emission reduction for different channels. So either, for example, if you remain with more stringent emission intensity benchmarks for efficiency improvement and CCUS deployment, or if there's an introduction of auctioning or a cap to encourage fuel switching to renewables. Its cost also, its policy cost effectiveness also depends on the design. So a cap and trade system can achieve the highest cost effectiveness by prioritizing lowest cost abatement opportunities, especially the fuel switching to renewables. And last but not least, introducing partial allowance auctioning or a cap and trade can even help for the ETS to help achieve renewables deployment targets, or even overachieve them, because it will be then able to provide the required financial incentive for further renewables build-up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fischer, for illustrating to us the potential of ETS in accelerating the clean energy transition. That was most interesting. Now we do have time for a few questions. Here at the Danish Embassy, we are a group of 16 colleagues from around the world, spanning across continents. And I have just received a question for you, Ms. Jerichau. It seems that wind has a much better match with consumption than solar. Hence, solar needs more reserves. How is this extra cost signaled to renewable energy project developers?
As of now, it's not very well signaled, but we are working on market reforms where we are moving towards full cost balancing. So we do have some imbalance fees, which should give some incentives, but I think in the future we will move towards more full cost balancing so that you are also paying for the problems that you create.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We also have a question for Mr. Fischer from IEA. What would be the major challenges of getting the full effect of ETS? Almost same cost, but there must be some differences in redistribution of economy, such as sunk costs, higher power prices for customers, etc., etc. Now, Mr. Fischer, I hope you're with us.
Sure. Yeah, and thank you for the question. I think the main challenge to actually make what you would refer to the ETS cap scenario happen is on the one hand that in our scenario we do see a significant reduction of running hours in coal-fired power plants, and of course that could lead to the fact of something called stranded assets, so that those assets are not able to recoup their initial investment cost. And this would need to be managed. For example, it could be through capacity markets or other mechanisms. And of course, another aspect that could or that is absolutely necessary is that there is the flexibility preconditions within the power market to accommodate such a significantly higher renewables share in the electricity generation mix. And I think thirdly, another point which you mentioned around higher power prices potentially, for example, if there's a liberalization of retail power prices as well, that could be also addressed if, for example, combining with partial auctioning, where a significant amount, and for example, we estimate that China could generate around 39 billion US dollars by 2035 with partial auctioning, so around a 25% auctioning share, which then of course can be used to redistribute and address also social impacts and distributive impacts that occur because of an ETS.
Thank you, Mr. Fischer, for a very elaborate answer. I believe we have time for one final question for the third speaker, Mr. Anders Hove. Hugh Slater is asking, Anders, you mentioned the need for energy market price signals. How do you communicate with Chinese counterparts on the risk of price spikes in a liberalized market, especially given the current situation in Europe?
Hugh, thank you very much for the question. It's a really great one, and I think that we have to understand and acknowledge on behalf of both European and American experts that the power markets are everywhere in the world a work in progress, and always there are debates in all of our countries about which direction power markets should go. I actually got my start in my career working on the California power crisis in 2000, where many of the same debates about the role of the spot power market and price signals were very live and active at that time. And I see basically many of the same problems recurring and many of the same questions recurring. I think in general, there is a widespread perception that the markets do need to have adjustments now. And I think we just have to communicate that, as well as understanding what services they can efficiently perform. I wanted to mention in response to the question number one as to what China has done to enable flexibility so far to integrate renewable energy in the system, and acknowledge that curtailment of wind and solar used to be very high. I believe the peak year was in 2014, higher than 17% annual wind curtailment in that year. And since that time, wind capacity and solar capacity have far more than doubled. So we have way more wind and solar now in China than previously, but curtailment has been brought under control, and that does reflect improvement in flexible operations of the power sector, including both the coal fleet, which has seen lower capacity factors as a result of prioritizing renewable energy, as well as more capacity on the transmission system and policies that prioritize renewable energy trading between provinces. So there are a number of measures that China has already taken, and I'd like to acknowledge those in my answer.
Thank you, Anders. Thank you very much, and thank you to all 4 speakers. Now I would like to give pass the baton to the moderator of session 2, Mr. Kåre Sandholt. I expect that most of the viewers tuning in from around the world today are familiar with Kåre. He is the international chief expert of the China Energy Transition Program at the Energy Research Institute of the Chinese Academy of Macroeconomic Research. Kåre, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Sune, and thank you for this session 1. I think we had a number of very interesting presentations and a lot of food for thoughts here, and we will actually use this panel discussion to digest some of the key messages that was provided from the presenters in session 1. But let me start with just a new anniversary. Actually, tomorrow, the 22nd of September, it's exactly 2 years ago since President Xi Jinping announced the dual carbon reduction target at the UN Assembly. So I think actually, well, I was a bit surprised it's so short time since this, because this announcement has deeply or radically changed the conversation about the green transition, the green transformation, both globally and in China. And I think we actually should celebrate this, that China has, throughout these 2 years, had already a tremendous amount of new initiatives and so on. And the discussion that we have today and so on, the frame for this is much more focused on carbon neutrality than if we had this discussion 2 years and 2 days before. So this is actually a very great framework for our discussion today. Let me briefly introduce the panel, and then we will start up with some questions, and hopefully also we will cover some of the questions asked by the audience. We will see how much we can follow up, and please continue to ask your questions. If we are not able to address it today, we will be able to in upcoming events to dive into more of these questions. Firstly, we have Changjing Jie, the Division Director of the Development Planning Department at the China Electricity Council. We have Yan Qin, the Lead Carbon Analyst from Refinitiv. We have Chen Zheng from China Southern Grid Energy Development Research Institute. We have Peter Philip Scherhorn, the Senior Electrical Engineering from Energy Nordics. And finally, but not least, we have Cesar Alejandro Fernandez, the head of the Renewable Integration and Secure Electricity Unit at the IEA. So a very good panel, and let's start up with some questions regarding this concept of the unified power markets and how that will influence the energy transformation in China. Let me start with you, Alejandro. We know the concepts, but we actually do not know the exact design of this unified power markets development in China. But I think the basic idea is very clear that the market should ensure both efficient market trading within provinces, but also across provinces. So, Alejandro, in your opinion, what are the main benefits of such a unified markets, and how can these benefits be obtained?
Thanks, Kåre. I think it would be very useful for us to start thinking, even before we began thinking on the energy transition. There were many benefits already for integrating markets. So there are many experiences that begun like that. No, in North America, there are many regions, many utilities that began sharing already in the 1920s. They need to find some ways to share resources, no, and all along the way, there are many countries and regions, Europe being one of those, or Japan, maybe one of the most recent, in which indeed integrating larger geographical areas people realize that they could bring many benefits. No, of course, the first one would be in terms of capacity. No, you always can take advantage of the fact. I remember one presentation 20 years ago, people showing how the British electricity demand actually was not the same. It didn't have the same shape as in France. No, so people were having tea at 4 p.m. So that's not a time for a busy in France, and they were already reducing the amount of peak capacity that they could need. But of course, and the main one is basically you had access to cheaper energy. No, regions in Canada, no, that they could export large amounts of electricity, and this until today, no, even if we were not thinking on the energy transition and systems with very large shares of renewables, this would be still huge benefits for China. And now, unfortunately, we need to add another benefit, which is resilience. So even when you are thinking on large systems with dispatchable capacity, you still find situations like the one in Brazil, with the worst drought in 100 years, or France, which has, as of today, 1/3 of the nuclear fleet out of service. And basically, they managed to handle these unexpected events that are affecting large shares of the fleet, of dispatchable fleets. And they are able to handle because Brazil invested, they have thousands of kilometers of interconnectors. And because France is in the heart of the European power system. So I think this would be a very good point to start, you know, on all these benefits. And if we go further, you know, in the future, when we see all these large shares of variable renewables getting to the systems, I think would be all these kind of benefits are amplified. No, having large shares of renewables from very different regions that they can have very different resources and very different demand patterns. That will certainly be much easier to handle. The economic benefits will be much larger. We have electricity systems that are working together. What it means unified, that's a question to be answered. I don't think it's necessarily one single system, but basically systems that are working in a coordinated manner. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much. So actually your strong recommendation to China, as I hear, is to continue to develop these unified markets. Let's look at when we talk about power markets, we talk about generation and dispatch of generation, but also the transmission grid has a vital role in the function of the market. We already heard that from Anders Sovi's presentation, but maybe Peter Philip, could you elaborate a bit on the role of these grids and the interplay between generation and grid in a well-functioning market?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Carl, for the question. Yes, I can elaborate on that a little bit. So as Ms. Jericho already mentioned in her very nice presentation, is of course for a well-functioning market, we need a well-functioning grid. In the end, we're talking about power supply here, and if we just, to phrase it very bluntly, if we want to sell power to someone, we need some way to get it there, and that's of course the role of the grid. It's been said that European national grids function so well that we sometimes tend to ignore them in the market. That's of course not completely true, but obviously in Europe we have a zonal market with zonal markets with bidding zones in the market typically conforming to the national borders of the different countries, with a few exceptions, Sweden, Norway, and Italy coming to mind. And that, of course, has some historical reasons and, of course, a political interest in national uniform pricing. So that means inside these different zones, we assume that there are no there's no grid congestion, and hence at least the day ahead and intraday markets ignore the role of the grid to a large degree, at least when it comes to trading inside a zone. Of course, that doesn't always work out completely. So the transmission operators are then allowed to intervene if they find congestion in the grid and can alleviate that via redispatch, which is built separately. But that's one approach of combining market and grid. The other one, of course, being employed mainly in America, is the nodal pricing approach, or locational marginal pricing, where the grid constraints are directly included in the market. The question which one to choose, and I'm not sure whether China has completely decided on that yet, and whether there may also be difference between the preferences of the different provinces. It's to a large degree a philosophical question, where Americans tend to prefer locational marginal pricing and Europeans tend to prefer zonal pricing. That also has historical reasons. Generally, academics tend to prefer locational marginal pricing. That's the directly optimal solution. That, of course, has some disadvantages as well in terms of long-term investment incentives and power market and market power issues. Zonal pricing or uniform pricing is largely historical. Also, it has largely historical reasons. Is with a structure that we see in both Europe and with the national grids, and in China with the provincial grids, easier to implement on top of that historical structure. It's got some more incentives for grid reinforcement, because the transmission operators have to basically make sure that all trades within a zone work, and then reinforce the grid if necessary. It does have some problems with locational incentives for generation. As mentioned, both Europe and China are apparently going for zonal grids, which makes sense from a historical point of view. If we talk about the unified market, we of course talk about, as Alejandro already mentioned, about like trades and interactions between the different areas, which could in Europe be the different countries or the different bidding zones, and in China would be the different provincial markets and provincial grids. Obviously, the grid constraints need to be somehow respected there, because the theoretical target of a European or a Chinese copper plate where all power can be freely traded is far away and probably unattainable. So grid constraints do play a role even in zonal markets, if interzonal, or in the Chinese case, interprovincial trades are at play. Obviously, we need a well-built out grid for renewable energy integration to make use of spatial effects that make renewables easier to integrate. And there's quite a lot of studies being done that we need quite a lot of investment in the grids to really go to a carbon-free future. Anders mentioned this Berkeley study, and there's a ton lot of literature out there and describing also the grid expansion in European systems. And obviously, we need to design the market and this grid constraints in the market to make optimal use of the grid infrastructure that we have. So obviously, the step one is we have no market coupling between the different zones or provinces. We have a connection. We can do bilateral trades. That's where I think China is at, and that's where Europe was at 20-25 years ago. Step two would be the NTC-based market coupling, where we slowly try to somehow find harmonized structures in the market and determine the transfer capacities that can be offered in the market between the different areas, based on grid simulations and the real grid constraints. And step three obviously would be flow-based market coupling, where we do that in real time based on grid simulations and try to optimize the use of grid capacity for every single time step. So market constraints should generally reflect the mesh nature of the grid, and shouldn't only be limited to point-to-point connections, and even HVDC integration into that, especially for HVDC that connects different zones or different provinces, that can be optimized. I think the more we can make use of the optimal use of the grid that we have available, and the more we incentivize also building out the grid to make use of spatial effects. We can also improve operational security. We can improve energy security of supply, as we see now in Europe, for example, with the example of France, which has traditionally been an exporter, now becomes an importer because they have some problems, but because all the infrastructure is basically set up to allow for that, we still don't have a blackout. So yeah, the grids can be, even though zonal markets tend to ignore large portions of the grid, the integration of grids into the markets can be quite important. And I think my statement has already been quite long. I'll keep it at that.
Thank you, Peter. And I think we could continue this discussion for a long time. Maybe we can come back to some of the issues you raised. Also, the role of point-to-point interconnectors, both in the Chinese and also in the European system in the future. But let's move on to this to the next question. Zheng Zhen, we ask in the title of this panel discussion, how will a unified power market contribute to a clean, secure, and affordable electricity, which are the goals for the Chinese development of the power system? But we could also ask if a unified system of power markets is sufficient to ensure these goals. I think some of the presenters we heard touched upon other markets. Do you see the need for other markets or measures to supplement the power markets?
Thank you so much for your question, Carl. First of all, the question that you just mentioned is really a big question.
I know.
I want to say three things on this question. First, I think safety and the green transition is very important. But at the same time, in the energy transition, these are all goals. So clean, safe, and affordable energy, these are things that we need to do simultaneously. Now we can see that climate change is showing its effects around the world. For example, we know that the Paris Agreement was signed in Europe, and there are goals for carbon neutrality. China also has its goals, peaking by 2035 and carbon neutrality by 2050. You have also seen the US, India make commitments as well. All of the major economies around the world have already proposed carbon peaking, carbon neutrality goals, and they are actively promoting the green transition in the energy sector. So this is just the objective reality. But at the same time, we must also realize that over the course of this transition, we also have many challenges on safety of supply. We can see in Europe, because of geopolitical conflict, there is an energy crisis underway. Now, we also need to have greater recognition of the fact that in the current system, we still do not have completely reliable power. Even the UK has proposed a nuclear development plan, for example. So different regions around the world have realized that they need to develop nuclear energy to supplement other forms of power. And this is also an issue that we're considering in China too. It's also because of supply and demand, they are not fully matched on the market. And this is a phenomenon in different regions in China. It's quite similar to Europe. So safety, reliability, affordability, this is something that we can rely on the market and our economic policy. This is the first point that I wanted to make. The second point, from the standpoint of the power market, can it achieve these three goals? Clean, secure, and affordable. I think it depends on the method that we use to design the power market. We can look from the best practices around the world. Currently, most countries are using a kind of simultaneous accomplishment of these three goals. For example, if you look at safety, we can see at PGM or the UK, Texas, Australia, they have pricing mechanisms, or Chile, Argentina, and other countries, they are also using various mechanisms to achieve this. As for the green transition, the US is allocating quotas. And in the UK, they are promoting renewables. And including China, we have direct subsidies for renewable energy. As for the economy, there are some market mechanisms, but perhaps they are less frequently relied upon. Mostly, countries are addressing the issue of affordability through spot markets and through the way these spot markets are designed around the world. The reform of the power market is something that is very important to this. We can see in the 80s, in the last century, when we started our economic reforms, we were trying to address economic issues. Now, several generations later, our economy and society have developed. We have safety and the environment, which we are now starting to consider more. Now, all countries, whenever they pick their reform model, they base it on the market, on the situation in their country. They use different methods to achieve their reform goals. Now, this kind of reform model is one model. It's a proactive model. So the positive side is that it's inexpensive, but on the other hand, it can be a bit controversial, this very proactive model, and it can lead to a loss of balance between the three goals. Now, the third point, can the power market achieve clean, safe, and green, these three goals? I think it can. And I think that this is something that we need to consider to think about. We have also proposed a way to achieve this. So if the current power market changes very little, all we need to do is rethink our capacity mechanism through power planning and sensitivity to signals, so that we can further incorporate renewables while considering the limitations that we have. And in this way, through our capacity market, we can achieve security, green, clean, and affordable electricity. Now, if you have any further questions, I call upon you to read some of the reports that we have published. Now, I think in China, in our reforms and our designs, there are several points that we need to take into consideration. The first is that we need to place emphasis on designing the medium and long-term capacity mechanism. So, for example, we could have a new type of power market to achieve this. Second, we need diversified sources of energy and bidding system. In the EU, the UK, because of high gas prices, we have seen that they have had to diversify the spot markets. So we think that this is a really great mechanism to diversify sources of energy. And there are two types of diversification. Two types of units that are used. And I think that this can then be served as the basis for the pricing mechanism. I'm not going to go into further detail here. The third point that we need to consider is we need to have a incentivizing mechanism for new energy. Now, this is something that can be done based on our needs for the energy transition. We need to consider our long-term development goals, and then we can decide on the investments in the new energy sector. In this way, we can avoid our new energy sector developing too quickly or too slowly. I know that we have time limits today, so I just wanted to share these thoughts with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen Jung. It was a very comprehensive answer, and I think you really touched upon some of the important considerations here, and clearly the energy security has a very big role here, and you also mentioned that some kind of supplement. Your message is that the power market will work, will give incentives, but there needs some supplement, especially on the capacity market. And I think one of the issues, at least we discussed a lot in Europe, is how to set up these mechanisms that in a way that they don't jeopardize the spot market function and actually prioritize some of the power plants who are actually contributing to capacity as well. There are some questions here that I think you already made some research on. It's very interesting to follow this development. I think I will go to you, Yanqing, because this is very close to what we already discussed about the power market function. We heard a lot about how excellent we have a power market in Europe and the long-term development and so on, but actually the current crisis also reveals risk for the power market. So my question to you, Yanqing, is that this current crisis in Europe, how does that impact the power market function? And do you see a need to adjust the power market design to deal with the crisis, the current crisis, but also crisis in the future?
Okay. Thanks, Cole. Hello, everyone, and thanks for IEA for inviting me to this insightful workshop. Well, as a market analyst here based in Norway, my daily work is really to follow European power and the carbon markets minute by minute. So I definitely have a lot to share from my frontline observations of really the turbulent energy markets. Well, indeed, as you mentioned and been discussed earlier as well, the energy crisis has triggered lots of discussions over the power market design in Europe. So following the rise in energy prices already since last autumn, regulators are closely monitoring this. And this April, ACER already published an assessment of the EU wholesale power market design. Well, it recommends keeping the current design and did suggest some improvements. Well, then in recent weeks, as we read in the news, both in Europe and in Chinese news as well, and Europe saw steep rise in electricity prices, with day-ahead market hitting 700 euro per megawatt hour in Western Europe on some days, and year-ahead German and French power futures spiking above 1,000 euros. This is extreme, and this even caused liquidity issues in energy derivatives trading. Then this new and very intensified situation triggered further debate of the current power market design, with the one key issue is really how to decouple gas from electricity prices. Because on one hand, the drought across Europe and reduced nuclear output makes gas power plants being the price setter for most of the time in wholesale power market under the marginal pricing mechanism. Where on the other hand, then the supply crunch is driving gas prices, which then pushes up power price even more. So from this perspective, and as an answer to your question, there are some elements in the current power market design that does not respond very well to the energy crisis, and these could be adjusted and improved. As Anders Hove already commented on this in the Q&A session just now, so I fully agree. Then last week, the European Commission unveiled the emergency intervention measures in energy markets to tackle the rising energy prices. So one of the measures is to cap revenues for inframarginal or lower cost electricity producers, so such as renewables and nuclear. And this revenue cap set at 100 euro per megawatt hour, well, is an intervention of the market for sure, but this is not a wholesale power price cap to say, and this is ex post adjustment. So the EU is clear, it will not change or distort the current day-ahead market clearing, the wholesale power market design. And yeah, one point I want to stress as well, in fact, it is because of the current market design and market order and market coupling, as Peter Philip mentioned, the cross-border flows can be allocated in a quite efficient way. While efficient utilization of interconnectors, they help to ensure energy security. So I have an example here. Last weekend, it's super windy in Denmark and Germany and most of Western Europe. And day-ahead power prices fell to almost zero midday in several countries. And it is really because of day-ahead market coupling and sufficient utilization of interconnector flows. And for that, we also, here in Norway, we also see quite low prices for 2 days. And in that, because of this, Norwegian hydropower producers, they can import more from the continent and they can save water in the reservoirs for the winter. So for the energy security for Norway and Nordics as well. Well, of course, the gas supply crunch will not disappear soon, and decoupling of gas and electricity prices will likely remain a top issue. And besides the besides the short-term measure, or maybe a bandage reform, as Director Chen mentioned just now, a good way to put it. But the EU and the Energy Commissioner has emphasized definitely the needs for more comprehensive reform of the wholesale electricity market, but they also emphasize that this is more of a midterm policy and takes time to implement. The European Commission signaled that it is conducting more analysis and plans to publish an assessment report early next year. Well, there is no doubt, as we seen from the presentations earlier and the discussions, power market design needs to evolve as renewables penetration increases and as we eventually move into a net zero future. Well, actually already in 2017, NSOE has already launched a project on market design 2030 and finished several rounds of consultation. Well, because energy sector is shifting from a fossil fuel dominated and more supply-centric model to a more clean, low carbon and digitalized and electrified consumer-centric system with many distributed resources. Well, yeah, I'll conclude that the energy crisis exhibits that a new decarbonized and decentralized electricity system raises its own security of supply changes, as we already see in Europe now. Well, new market designs are needed to address those challenges and to incentivize also the proper level of low carbon investments. Well, we'll see more discussion and proposals, as I mentioned, in Europe. Yet, China has made notable progress in the power market reform, as shown in the presentation by EPBEI colleagues. Well, China also launched 2 batches of spot power markets pilots provinces. And what's for me is very interesting to see a various market design options is being tested in this a dozen of pilots. Collaboration as the workshop today is definitely also much needed going forward for us to search for a power market design to fit for the future, both in China and Europe. So I'll stop here and thank you again for inviting me and thank you all.
Thank you, Jan, for this very comprehensive answer. My takeaway is that changes are needed, but the changes should be very careful not to jeopardize the efficiency of the market, as you illustrate very well with the market already today create great incentives for optimizing the whole market system and not only making sub-optimization in different areas. We also should touch upon the carbon pricing. We had a very good presentation from David Fisher on with very interesting analysis on different future mechanisms. And I would like to ask you, Zhang Gie, in your view, what are the next steps in China to develop the emission trading system, especially in the context of a unified power market system?
Thank you, Carl, and I'm so glad to join this discussion. And you know, I've joined the process of design the ETS of the national China carbon market. Through this process, I think it's necessary to accelerate the promotion of power and carbon market system establishment to adapt the dual carbon goals. The carbon market mechanism is a major national strategy to achieve low-cost emission reduction in the whole society. As there is a strong coupling relationship between the power market and the carbon market. You know, till now, I think we should focus on the peak shaving and flexibility mechanism for thermal power to support new energy in the carbon market. With the stable operating of the national carbon market, the existing regulations on benchmark energy conservation adjust factor need to be adjusted and revised in combination with the thermal function orientations of generating units. So I think there's several knowledge and regulation we should to give much more attention. First, I think in the mechanism designing, it's very necessary to scientifically grasp the new orientation of the thermal plant, especially the coal power in building the new power system. This is a strategic perspective. According
that was very unfortunate because this was a very interesting line of argumentation that John was answering here. I hope Zhang Gie will be back soon. We might take one question from the audience. We have one question. I'm not sure if who will want to answer this, but they go for the green electricity trading markets. Is that the way to replace state subsidies for renewable energies development? Is the question. Zhang, do you have you want to answer this question, or anyone else in the panel?
First of all, is my personal understanding of this. Green electricity market. We have allowance allocation and matching projects. As for specific consumer, we require a specific proportion of a green electricity plus our green electricity trading. If we have this development mechanism to a certain degree, we can lower the cost of a green electricity. That is also the question on subsidy. Currently, in fact, without the existence of allocation by the government based on voluntary choice, the whole green electricity its cost and efficiency are both limited. This is my comment on green electricity. Actually, including green electricity trading or other technologies, they provide us with alternative policy choices. Using these choices, we can better develop and deploy green energy. That's all from me.
Thank you very much. I think you're totally right that we already seen that the feed-in tariff system has been phased out in China, and a number of other mechanisms has been introduced. And currently, as you point out, there are several ways that these mechanisms support the renewable energy deployment. Zhang Jingjie, you are back? Maybe. Yeah, we can almost hear you, but not very clear. While we wait for Ms. Zhang to be back, maybe I could ask you, Yan-Tin, a similar question. When you have monitored the European ETS system for several years and have a very detailed understanding of how that works, if you compare the Chinese ETS and European ETS, what are the, as you see it, the development trends in both regions?
Yeah, thanks. Well, for the comparison, like my view also when I communicate experiences from European carbon markets to China, and actually I always stress first, we can't compare China ETS in 2022 with EU ETS in 2022, because we should compare when both scheme has started. So yeah, so it's a bumpy start and we need to be patient. And second, I think it's mentioned in several presentations, and as well, a well-functioning ETS or to make carbon price to really send an effective signal to both penalize fossil fuel power producers, and incentivize low carbon generation. We really need a more liberalized power market so that the carbon costs can pass through, which is still at an early stage in China, of course. Even there are progress in the power market reform. And this is what I always emphasize as well, when power and the carbon markets goes hand in hand. And in addition to that, I mean, the question on green electricity trading and etc. also shed some light on, I think there will also be characteristics for Chinese carbon markets where we may see a multiple policy instrument being utilized for just to fitting more for the sort of the features of how China is developing the power system, the vast renewables deployment, and specifically with more renewable resources in the West, and you have load center in the East. So we need both the carbon price signal with thermal power producers covered in the scheme, and probably also more uptake in the green power trading, green certificates to, I guess, to discover the environmental attributes of this green electricity. And so I would say I foresee a combination of several different policy instruments goes alongside the ETS.
Thank you very much. I was actually, I think in David's presentation, it was very, very interesting to see how the different design would actually influence the technology choices. If we follow the different scenarios, if you continue with the system like the current one, the benchmark, you will see more emphasis on CCUS and CCS for coal-fired power plants. And if you go for a cap, you will have more incentives for moving away from fossil fuels. And I think actually, if we also look at the need for capacity and flexibility. China basically needs to have fossil fuel plants on grid, but not producing a lot, which actually also tends to not invest a lot in CCS. So there's a lot of more or less contradictions in the way that these incentives could work. And I think you're definitely right. China should look at several mechanisms, but the challenge is how does that actually how are these measures coordinated, and do they actually achieve what is needed to reach these dual targets? But I'm sure we will discuss this a lot more. Zhang are you back? I hope you are, because this is very interesting, your answer on what we heard. It seems difficult. I really hope we will have another opportunity to learn from Zhang Jie's research. I will ask the panel, Peter, for you heard, besides your own answer, your very good answer, you heard other answers, and maybe you have some last reflections before we close the panel.
Well, with regards to of course decarbonization markets, green energy trading, there's quite a lot to process from the different answers and the different questions. I'd like to refer to another discussion we had in a similar seminar last week on green power trading, because that was mentioned. So someone asked whether this green power trading scheme could replace like direct incentives for renewables. I think that could work, because I mean the renewable portfolio standards in the US and some strategies employed in Scandinavia have shown that that's perfectly possible. But what we still have to keep in mind is that, of course, these renewable energy certificates and this bulk renewable energy trading on an annual basis is great in incentivizing the installation of renewable energy capacity, but it's not particularly good at incentivizing the proper integration of that. So it works as long as we're just basically integrating additional renewable capacities into the grid. But when we have to worry about a complete system transformation, and we're basing our system to a large degree or completely on renewables, which could start to happen somewhere between the IEA integration phases 3 and 4, then we really need to think about timestamps on the renewable energy trading, and trading this power actually in real time, so it corresponds with the demand, which is one of the big challenges, I guess, going forward. As we've shown, for example, Germany is a nice example of how renewable energy integration can work, even with a coal-based system, because if we force the coal units to operate flexibly, that kind of works. When we now hit about 50% renewable energy share, and I have a feeling that strategy is at least at the end of its capabilities. So now we actually need to start worrying about storage, about more about the grids, about additional enabling technologies to actually increase our renewable share further than that. And I think that's the great challenge going forward. And also the markets and the trading schemes need to reflect that, and we need to really clearly analyze the structures, whether they set the right incentives for the right enabling technologies and the right investments.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot. Finally, Zhang, do you have any concluding remarks from your side?
No, that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, and Alexander, I will not ask you because you have possibilities to wrap up. So I will actually end the panel discussion. Thank you very much to the whole panel, and thank you for the audience for listening. I will give the floor back to Jacques.
Many thanks to our moderator, Kare, and to all 5 panelists for sharing their insights and for these interesting considerations. We could have continued, of course, but time is limited. So we have now to wrap up the session and go ahead with the concluding remarks. So the last two speakers of today will be Jens Hein from the Danish Energy Agency, and then Alejandro Hernandez from the IEA will finalize the workshop. So I will hand over to Jens Hein, who is a senior advisor and the head of the China section at the Danish Energy Agency, who will give us his concluding remarks. The floor is yours, Jens. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jacques. And thank you to all of our speakers and to everyone who's participated today. Here at the Danish Energy Agency, we're happy to have been able to support this meeting, and we're very grateful to the IEA and our other partners for organizing it. Events like this are particularly important at the moment, since unfortunately we're not able to travel to China. So it's been really great to see our speakers and other participants throwing themselves into the discussion like this. Transforming the power sector is more than just a component of the overall green transition. With increasing electrification, it's a fundamental enabling condition for both the emissions reductions and the energy security that's required both in China and elsewhere. For this reason, it's encouraging to hear about policy developments in China and the policy focus that this issue receives. And it's also great to have had set out so clearly from the perspective of other countries how power markets, emissions trading systems, and state-of-the-art balancing measures can contribute to power sector transformation. One thing that stands out particularly clearly is the role that a properly unified system of power markets must play in order to drive the transformation, giving us the flexibility and the price signals that we need. Likewise, from the Danish perspective, our participation in an integrated international power market with effective transmission lines is a key factor in our own transformation. Another aspect is that the various policy measures that we've discussed, power markets, carbon pricing, and so on, must actually be aligned in such a way that they function together and become mutually reinforcing. That's to say, we can't simply pick and mix. We need systems thinking to unlock the potential of each of the individual tools in our toolbox. And for that to happen, strategic planning is necessary. Planning that is long-term and can therefore provide certainty, take on vested interests, and ultimately bring about the transformational change that's required in a way that's just not possible simply with gradual iterations of an existing system. On our website, we have a report called From Black to Green, which shows how the Danish energy utility Ørsted went from being almost entirely fossil fuel based to renewable energy through long-term energy planning and competition-based reforms on the regulatory side, and through a determined strategy for transitioning into the renewable energy market on the company side. I'd encourage you all to read that report if you haven't already. Here at the Danish Energy Agency, we work closely with NDRC's Energy Research Institute on modeling China's energy system and creating scenarios for how it could develop out to the carbon targets in 2030 and 2060. And it's clear from this work that the energy system that China will need is one built on replacing coal with renewable energy and on using electricity as a substitute for fossil fuels in end-use sectors. And this is, of course, predicated on successfully reshaping the power sector, which means that if China is to meet its carbon targets, then there really isn't an alternative to the kind of comprehensive transformation that we've been discussing here today. So energy security has to be found in committing to and optimizing a renewable energy system rather than in hedging with fossil fuels. The good news is that this is eminently possible, as we're finding here in Denmark. And I very much look forward to continuing the dialogue with all of you on what this will look like in the case of China. Those are all of my comments. Thank you all again for participating in this meeting, and I look forward to seeing you in China as soon as possible.
Thank you, Jens. And now our last speaker will be Alejandro Hernandez from the International Energy Agency.
Thanks very much, Jacques. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all of you, in particular, Mr. Thomas Ostrup-Müller, Ambassador of Denmark to China, Ms. Xu Xin, Division Director of the Department of Legislative Affairs and Energy Sector Restructuring of the NEA, and Mr. Xiang Xihong, Vice President of EPPI. I would like to thank all the speakers and all the panelists for all their clever insights. And of course, all the audience for all the questions and the discussion. So I think we have heard a very broad picture, a very complete picture of what are the challenges that China has in the coming years. We have heard all the policies, all the objectives, and we are confident that China will achieve the objectives that it imposes itself. A lot of what we have heard is a discussion on power markets and how it interacts also with the renewables, with the carbon markets. And I think this is, I would say, a kind of an insight. What we have heard of other jurisdictions, such as Germany, is that they have managed to transform their systems, the systems that were run in the same way for many, many years. They are going through a successful transformation into systems that are taking advantage of new technologies, no? That they can provide large shares of energy, like variable renewables, and gradually are starting to get into the new services that are needed in the case of Denmark, and in which new technologies like storage, no, in which they might not provide as much energy, but they are very flexible and they can provide some peak capacity. And of these new services that are bringing to the system, there are smart ways to getting into a system. So, and I think this would be, rather than a recipe, I don't think there would be a North American or a European or a recipe, etc. So of course, China has to find its own path, and we are very confident that China will find a successful path, which gradually integrates. We have heard at the same time, we know that there is some kind of planning that will be needed, and it's a smart trick to understand how this planning on all these policies that at the same time are needed to foster investment is actually possible to make them compatible with markets, because markets, it's important to remind them, they are a tool to achieve policy objectives. The thing is that they are an incredibly powerful tool. So it's very important when we talk about market design, is really a thing, say, how do we make everyone to have the right incentives to go in the right direction? And once again, we are confident that China will find its own path in that direction. I would like to finish also saying that since following the publication of the guidance of the Chinese national authorities, that we expect China to move very quickly in the direction of establishing a national system of power markets. The IEA intends to support these efforts, and we will start working on this, and we will publish a report in the spring of the next year in order to provide insights and recommendations for this purpose. So the questions raised today and the discussion that took place will all be very helpful in that project. And I thank you all again for participating in this event, and wish you a very good day for the rest of the day. Thanks so much.
Thank you to all the speakers and to the attendees who stayed until the end. The good news is that next week we will post the presentations and the recording of this event on the IEA website where the registration was found. So thank you again, everyone, to our moderators, speakers, and participants, and we hope to see you soon. Have a good rest of the day.